You're just a mechanic." Derek Vaughn's hand closed around Maya's arm, like a vice yanking her away from the helicopter she'd spent 3 hours inspecting. "Sign the clearance, now." His grip tightened. The other pilots watched. Nobody moved. Maya looked down at his hand on her arm, then slowly raised her eyes to his face. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She simply said in a voice so quiet it didn't carry past the two of them, "Let go of me." Something in her stillness made Derek hesitate. Just for a second. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel right now and follow Maya's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Nobody looked twice at the woman covered in engine grease. That was not an accident. Maya Reynolds had spent years learning how to disappear inside a crowd. She knew exactly how to move through a space without drawing eyes. She knew how to keep her posture loose, her expression blank, her hands busy. At the Apex Aviation Maintenance Hangar outside El Paso, Texas, she was simply part of the background. A mechanic. One of 8 on the morning shift. She arrived before anyone else, and she left after most of them had gone home, and in the months she had worked there, she had never once given the pilots or the contractors or the visiting executives a reason to look at her twice. She had worn the same worn boots for 2 years, the same faded coveralls with the name patch that said Maya in block letters above the left breast pocket. She kept her dark hair tied back under a cap, and she never wore anything that might invite a second glance. The other mechanics knew her as reliable and quiet. The kind of person you trusted to finish a job without being told twice, and who never complained about the hours or the heat. What they did not know was that she had chosen every single part of that invisibility on purpose. The Apex hangar ran around the clock. It serviced private aircraft government contractors and occasional military transport, and the work was demanding and precise and relentless. The facility was remote enough that the people who worked there developed a kind of insular rhythm. The same faces every day, the same routines, the same unspoken hierarchies. Pilots sat at the top of that hierarchy. Engineers and technicians came next. And at the very bottom were the mechanics, the people who crawled beneath aircraft in the dark and got their hands dirty while everyone else stood around making decisions. Maya had worked maintenance before, in environments that would have broken most people, and she found something clarifying about physical labor that required your complete attention. When she was inside an engine casing, or tracing a hydraulic line, or calibrating a rotor assembly, there was no room for anything else. No memories, no noise, just the work. She had needed that when she came back. She had needed something to fill the silence. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Maya arrived at 5:45 minutes before her official shift began. She did this every day, not because she was required to, but because she liked the hangar when it was quiet. She liked walking the aircraft before the day started, before the pilots came in with their coffee and their attitude and their schedules. She liked that first hour when it was just her and the machines. She was working on the Bell 429 helicopter, a civilian transport variant that had come in 2 days ago for routine checks before a contracted mission. On the surface, everything about the aircraft looked clean. The log was current. The previous maintenance sign-off was dated and initialed. But when Maya had run her own inspection the afternoon before, something had stopped her. A vibration in the tail rotor assembly that was subtle enough to miss on a quick pass but wrong in a way that she recognized at a level that went beyond training. She had flagged it. She had written it up in the maintenance log clearly and in detail the way she had been trained to document everything in environments where documentation was the difference between accountability and catastrophe. Then she had gone home, slept 4 hours, and come back before dawn to look at it again. She was still looking at it when the first vehicles pulled into the facility lot. 4 SUVs. Government contractor plates. The kind of convoy that told you the people inside considered themselves important before they had even walked through the door. Maya heard them before she saw them. She registered the sound of the vehicles, the number of doors opening and closing, the cadence of footsteps crossing the lot. 6 people. At least one of them walked with the deliberate stride of someone used to having others step out of their way. She stayed focused on the tail rotor. The doors to the hangar rolled open, and the group came in with a blast of morning air. 3 pilots in civilian flight gear. 2 men in suits who were clearly management types accompanying someone important. and walking at the front with the particular confidence of a man who had never once walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged there, Captain Derek Vaughn. Maya had seen his type before. The kind of man who wore competence like a performance. He was tall, mid-40s, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of being the most senior person in whatever environment he occupied. He had excellent posture and an easy authority to his movements. Everything about him said that he was the kind of man who had been told many times over a long career that he was exceptional. He glanced around the hangar, the way a man assesses a space he intends to take control of. His eyes passed over Maya without stopping. She had expected that. The team spread out. The suited men went toward the operations office at the back. The other pilots began their pre-mission walk-around, which was standard, and which Maya watched from the corner of her vision while she continued her work. She had already identified the Bell 429 as the primary transport aircraft for this mission. The mission brief was posted in the operations room, a 6-hour transport run, carrying time-sensitive equipment to a federal facility in New Mexico. 2 pilots, 4 passengers, 1 helicopter. The helicopter currently sitting in her maintenance bay with a flag on its tail rotor assembly. Derek reached the Bell 429 first. He stood beside it for a moment, looking it over with the expression of a man who was already satisfied. Then he picked up the maintenance log from the hook near the nose of the aircraft and began flipping through it. Maya heard him stop. She heard the sound of pages going back. She heard him say quietly to the pilot beside him, "What is this?" It was not a question. Maya straightened up slowly, wiping her hands on a rag. "That would be my flag," she said. "Tail rotor assembly. There's an anomalous vibration pattern in the pitch control mechanism. I've written it up on page 11. It needs a full diagnostic before that aircraft is cleared for flight." Derek looked at her. The look was not aggressive, not yet. It was the look of a man recalibrating who he was dealing with and landing on an answer that satisfied him very quickly. "You're the mechanic." "One of them," Maya said. He held up the maintenance log. "This flag is on a bird that needs to be in the air in 4 hours." "I understand that." "Do you?" He said it flat, not as a question. "Do you understand that this mission has been scheduled for 3 weeks, that there are federal contractors waiting on the receiving end, that the window for this flight closes at noon?" "I understand all of that," Maya said. "I also understand that there is a mechanical issue with the tail rotor assembly that has not been resolved, and I cannot sign a clearance on an aircraft with an unresolved mechanical issue." Derek closed the maintenance log and set it down with a particular kind of deliberateness that communicated very clearly that he considered this conversation to already be over. "Get me the lead engineer," he said to one of the other pilots. He did not say it to Maya. He said it past her as if she had already stopped being relevant. "The lead engineer is Thomas Reed," Maya said. "He won't be in until 7. Then we wait until 7 and we get this sorted out." He turned away from her and began talking to his co-pilot in a low voice. The message was unmistakable. "You are dismissed." Maya went back to work. She went back to the tail rotor, because the flag was real, and regardless of schedules and federal contractors and the particular ego of one Captain Derek Vaughn, the flag was still real. Thomas Reed arrived at 6:58. He was a 63-year-old engineer who had been working aviation maintenance for 35 years, and he moved through the hangar with the unhurried authority of a man who had outlasted 100 hotshot pilots in his career. He had silver hair and heavy-framed glasses, and he was almost always the calmest person in any room. He found Maya first before he had even set down his bag. "I got the call," he said quietly. "Vaughn already reached our operations director. He wants the flag cleared." "The flag isn't clearable yet," Maya said. "Not without the diagnostic." Thomas looked at the helicopter. "Walk me through it." She did. She walked him through the full inspection, showing him the specific data she had logged, demonstrating the measurement anomalies in the pitch control mechanism, explaining the failure scenario that the pattern suggested. She did it the way she always did things, systematically, without drama, presenting the information and letting the information speak for itself. Thomas listened to everything. He asked 3 precise questions. Then he stood in silence for a moment, and then he said, "You're right." "I know," Maya said. "He's not going to like it." "I know that too." Derek Vaughn did not like it. The conversation in the operations office lasted 22 minutes, and Maya was not in the room for it, but she could read the aftermath clearly in the way Derek came back onto the hangar floor. His jaw was set. His movements were clipped and aggressive. The co-pilot and the two suited men trailed behind him with the careful positioning of people who have learned to give a certain kind of man a wide berth when he is in a certain kind of mood. He walked directly toward Maya. She was underneath the helicopter when she heard him coming, and she did not stop working. She heard him stop near the helicopter's nose. She heard the sound of him breathing through his nose the way people do when they are controlling anger with effort. "I just spoke with your operations director," Derek said. "I heard. He informed me that the call on the clearance is yours." "That's correct." A pause. "That seems like a significant amount of authority for someone in your position." Maya slid out from under the helicopter and stood up looking at him directly. "My position is aviation maintenance technician, licensed and certified. Airworthiness determinations are my responsibility." "Yes." "Your responsibility." He said it like he was tasting something unpleasant. "How many flight hours do you have?" Maya looked at him steadily. "That's not relevant to an airworthiness determination. I'm asking because I want to understand who I'm dealing with." "You're dealing with the person who flagged a mechanical fault in your primary transport aircraft," Maya said. "That's all you need to know right now." The hangar had gotten quieter around them. The other mechanics on the morning shift had not stopped working, but they had slowed down, and the particular quality of their not quite attention made it clear that they were listening. Derek took a step closer. "Let me tell you what I think," he said. "I think you found a number that was outside normal range on a standard inspection, and you wrote it up because that's what they tell you to do, and now you're covering yourself in case something goes wrong. I think you don't fully understand what that flag means in the context of this mission and who is affected by it. And I think that if you actually understood what you were doing, you would recognize that the risk assessment here is above your pay grade." He delivered all of this in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. It was controlled contempt, precise and practiced. Maya let him finish. Then she said, "The pitch control mechanism shows a vibration signature consistent with early-stage fatigue. Failure in the pitch horn assembly. Under normal operating load, that's manageable. Under the load conditions of a 6-hour flight at altitude, with a full passenger. Manifest. The probability of progression to critical failure is not acceptable. That's not a numbers call. That's a physics call. And you're right that it's above your pay grade because it's an engineering determination, not a flight determination." Silence. Derek stared at her. Behind him, Maya saw Thomas Reed standing in the doorway to the operations office watching. "I don't know where you got your credentials," Derek said slowly. "But this is a $100,000 mission with federal backing, and I am not going to let a mechanic ground my aircraft based on a judgment call." "It's not a judgment call," Maya said. "It's documented. It's in the log. You can read it." "I've read it." "Then you know what it says." "What I know," Derek said, and his voice had shifted now lower and harder, "is that I have been flying for 22 years, and I have never once had a ground crew tell me what is and is not safe to fly. That is my determination. That aircraft," he pointed at the Bell 429, "is my aircraft, and I will make the call on whether it flies." "Not without a clearance from maintenance," Maya said. "And I haven't signed it." Something moved across Derek Vaughn's face that Maya recognized. She had seen it before in other high-stakes situations. It was the moment when a certain kind of person stopped arguing and moved toward something more direct. He was done talking. He was done persuading. He had decided somewhere in the last 2 minutes that this situation required a different kind of solution. He reached out and took the maintenance log from the hook beside the helicopter. He opened it to page 11, where Maya's flag was documented. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "Clear the aircraft." "And I'm going to tell you one more time," Maya said quietly. "No." Derek set the log down. He turned to the co-pilot and said, "Go get Harmon." Then he turned back to Maya, and the look on his face now was not anger exactly. It was the look of a man who had decided to stop treating someone as a problem to be negotiated with and start treating them as an obstacle to be removed. Harmon turned out to be the operations director, a heavy-set man named Bill Harmon, who had been running the facility for 11 years and who had the particular look of someone who had learned long ago that avoiding confrontation was the safest strategy for staying employed. He came out of the back office blinking and carrying a coffee mug that he held like a shield. "Maya," Bill said, "we're in a difficult spot here." "I understand that, Bill. The client this is a significant contract for us. Federal money, long-term relationship." "I understand that too. Is there any way to—" He stopped. He tried again. "What if we accelerated the diagnostic? What if we had two of you on it and we pushed to get it done in—" "The diagnostic takes as long as it takes," Maya said. "I'm not cutting corners on a pitch control inspection because someone has a deadline." Bill looked at Derek. Derek said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Maya," Bill said, and his voice had shifted into something careful and apologetic, which was worse than anger in some ways, because it told you what was coming. "I have to think about the facility here. I have to think about our relationship with the contractors. If you're not willing to be flexible on this—" "I'm not being inflexible," Maya said. "The aircraft has a fault. I've documented it. I'm doing my job. I know that, but—" "But what?" Maya looked at him directly. "But the client is important. Clients are always important, Bill. And so are the 4 people who are going to be sitting in that helicopter for 6 hours over the desert." Silence. Bill's coffee mug came up a little higher. Derek turned away from both of them and walked back toward the Bell 429. He stood in front of it for a moment, and then in a movement. So sudden it startled the mechanics nearest to him. He slammed his hand flat against the side of the fuselage. The sound rang out through the hangar like a gunshot. "This is ridiculous," he said, not loudly, but with a cold, controlled fury that was more unsettling than shouting. He turned around and looked at Maya across the hangar floor. "You want to know what I think? I think you don't belong in this hangar. I think you don't understand what real aviation responsibility looks like. I think you flagged this aircraft because somewhere in the back of your mind, you needed to feel important this morning." Maya said nothing. "I think," Derek continued, walking back toward her slowly, "that you have spent too long under aircraft and not enough time understanding the larger picture. I think the reason you are a mechanic and not a pilot is because you lack the judgment to make difficult calls under pressure." He stopped 2 feet in front of her. "And I think that right now you are going to do your job, which is to fix the problem you've identified as quickly as possible so that my aircraft can fly on time. Not because of the client, not because of the contract, but because I am telling you to." The hangar was utterly quiet. Even the ventilation systems seemed to hold their breath. Maya looked at Derek Vaughn for a long moment without speaking. She thought about several different responses. She considered and discarded all of them. What she settled on was the same thing she had been doing all morning, which was to look at him with the steady, unhurried calm of someone who has stood in front of much worse and not moved. "I'm going to do the diagnostic," she said. "I'm going to do it the right way. And when I'm done, I'm going to write up exactly what I found. And if what I found confirms what I already believe, I'm not going to sign the clearance, and you're not going to fly this aircraft today." She paused. "And if you'd like to bring in another licensed AMT to review my findings, you're welcome to do that. They'll tell you the same thing." Derek stared at her. Something shifted in his eyes. "Who do you think you are?" he said. It came out different from the way he had said everything else. Less controlled. A genuine question under the performance. "I'm the mechanic," Maya said simply. "Now let me get back to work." Derek stood very still for another 3 seconds. Then his hand shot out and closed around her arm, just above the elbow, not violently, but with the particular grip of a man who has decided that words have run out, and physical pressure is the next tool available. He pulled her toward him. Not hard, but unmistakably, the way you move someone when you want to demonstrate that they can be moved. "You are going to sign that clearance," he said very quietly, very close. "Do you understand me?" Maya looked down at his hand on her arm. She did not pull away. She did not react the way most people would have reacted, with fear or submission, or the reflexive scramble for distance that the grip was designed to produce. She simply looked at his hand on her arm, and then she looked up at his face, and what he found in her expression was not anger, not distress, not the thing he had expected to find. What he found was a kind of recognition. As if she had seen this moment before, in different configurations, in different places, and had already made her peace with how it ended. "Let go of my arm," she said. Quiet. Absolute. Something in her voice made him hesitate. The hesitation lasted only a second, but in that second, he shifted his grip, not releasing, but adjusting, and the movement torqued the worn cuff of her coverall. Just wrong, and the old fabric gave at the seam along her forearm, pulling back along the left sleeve in a rough tear that exposed her forearm below the elbow. The hanger was already quiet. Now it went still. Derek's grip did not release immediately. His eyes moved down to her forearm. The sleeve had pulled back far enough to reveal a portion of the inner forearm, and what was there had not been visible a moment ago under the grease-covered coverall. A tattoo. Not the kind of amateur ink that covered a lot of arms in a maintenance facility. Something older, precise, in the way that things are precise when they are done with specific and deliberate intention. The lines were faded with years, but the image was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around military aviation, around the particular culture of the special operations community that operated at the edge of everything. A Navy SEAL emblem. The trident, the anchor, the eagle, the pistol, the marks around it. A faint series of additional lines that surrounded the central image were not standard issue. They were unit-specific, the kind of modification that happened informally, outside any official protocol, among people who had been through specific things together and wanted something that the rest of the world would not fully read. Derek's grip went slack. His hand dropped from her arm. He stood there looking at her forearm. Thomas Reed, who had been standing in the doorway of the operations office for the last 12 minutes, saying nothing, took one step out onto the hangar floor. His face had changed. He was looking at Maya with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something more complicated. Something that had the quality of pieces falling into place. One of the junior mechanics, a young man named Carlos, who had been doing his best to appear focused on a completely unrelated task. For the past 20 minutes, had stopped pretending. He was staring. Everyone in the hangar was staring. Maya reached down and slowly, deliberately pulled her sleeve back over her forearm. The fabric was torn and would not lie flat, but she adjusted it as best she could, and then she picked up the maintenance log from where Derek had set it down, and she looked at the page 11 documentation she had written the previous afternoon. "I'm going to do the diagnostic now," she said in exactly the same voice she had been using all morning. "If you want, you can observe." She did not look at Derek again. She did not look at Thomas, or at Carlos, or at any of the other faces turned toward her across the hangar floor. She just moved back toward the helicopter, pulled her inspection light from her belt, and went to work. And the hangar, which had been very loud that morning in all the ways that mattered, went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Because something had shifted. Not the aircraft. Not the fault in the tail rotor assembly. Not the deadline or the contract or the federal money waiting in New Mexico. Something else had shifted. And everyone in the hangar felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm arrives. A fundamental reorganization of the way one person understood the space they were standing in. Derek Vaughn stood very still. How was a man who had spent 22 years being the most qualified person in any room he walked into, and he was experiencing for perhaps the first time in a very long time, the particular disorientation that comes when you realize you have fundamentally misread a situation from the very beginning? He looked at Thomas Reed. Thomas looked back at him. Neither man said anything. But the question between them was the same question that had just reorganized the entire morning. Who was the woman underneath the helicopter, and why was she here? Thomas Reed was not a man who showed surprise easily. He had spent 35 years in aviation maintenance, which meant he had spent 35 years watching pilots behave badly under pressure, watching engineers make judgment calls that turned out wrong, watching machines that looked perfect from the outside fail in ways nobody had anticipated. He had developed over those decades a kind of emotional steadiness that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was just that he had learned to hold himself very still when things got loud around him, because stillness was where the information lived. But right now, standing at the edge of the hangar floor, with his coffee getting cold in his hand, Thomas Reed was not entirely still. He was watching Maya Reynolds work, and he was thinking about something he had not thought about in a long time. There was a story that had circulated through certain corners of the military aviation world about 4 years ago. It had never made it into any official report, and it had never made it into the press. And the reason for both of those things was the same reason that most of the significant stories from that world never went anywhere, because the people involved did not want them to. The story was the kind that traveled by word of mouth from one person to another, in quiet conversations, in hangars and briefing rooms, and the kind of bars that attracted a specific clientele. Thomas had heard it from a retired warrant officer who had been on the periphery of the incident, close enough to know the outline, but not close enough to know the details. An aircraft had gone down during an extraction operation. Not in combat exactly, but in the kind of environment where the distinction between combat and not combat was the kind of philosophical question you did not have time to ask. The extraction team had been on the ground in a situation that was deteriorating faster than the timeline had anticipated, and the helicopter that was supposed to get them out had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. The warrant officer had been vague on the specifics because that was how those stories worked. You knew the shape of the thing without knowing the details. But what he had been clear about was the person who had kept the extraction team alive long enough for secondary support to arrive. A woman. Attached to the team in an unusual capacity that the warrant officer had declined to explain precisely. Someone with enough mechanical knowledge to do something to the damaged aircraft under conditions that should have made it impossible. Someone who had refused to leave the team behind even when extraction had been officially called off. Thomas had filed the story away in the back of his mind, the way you file things that you cannot verify but that carry enough weight to stay with you. He had not thought about it in probably 2 years. He was thinking about it now. I was thinking about it because of the tattoo. Yes, but also because of something he had noticed about Maya Reynolds long before this morning. Something he had noticed on her second day at the facility, and had never been able to fully explain the way she moved through the hangar, the way she positioned herself, the way she looked at aircraft, not the way a maintenance technician looks at an aircraft, but the way a pilot does, the way someone does who has sat inside them and felt them respond and understands them from the inside out. The way she had flagged the tail rotor fault without a full diagnostic run based on a vibration pattern she had felt during a manual inspection that most technicians would have written off. You did not develop that kind of recognition from textbooks. You developed it from flying broken aircraft in places where broken aircraft were all you had. Thomas set his coffee mug down on a workbench and walked across the hangar floor toward the Bell 429. Derek Vaughn was standing 10 feet away from the helicopter, not moving, which was itself unusual. Derek was a man who filled space when he was in it, who moved and gestured and occupied the air around him. Standing still did not come naturally to him. But he was standing still now, and his eyes were on Maya, who was underneath the tail section with her inspection light, and whatever was happening behind his eyes was not something Thomas could fully read. Thomas stopped beside him. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Derek said very quietly without looking at Thomas. "What is she doing here?" Thomas considered that question. "Working," he said. Derek looked at him. "You know what I mean." Thomas did know what he meant. The question was not about the hangar. It was the same question that was reorganizing the morning for everyone who had been present for the last 20 minutes. What was a person with those credentials doing in a maintenance facility in El Paso, tightening bolts and changing filters and staying invisible? "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "But I know she's right about the helicopter." Derek said nothing to that. "I've reviewed her documentation," Thomas continued. "The fault is real. The diagnostic needs to happen. Whatever else is going on here, that part isn't up for debate." Derek's jaw worked for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the operations office without another word, and the door closed behind him, and Thomas was left standing on the hangar floor, with the quiet that Maya had created simply by refusing to move. The diagnostic took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Maya ran, the way she ran everything methodically, without shortcuts, without the kind of optimistic interpretation of borderline readings that happened when someone was under schedule pressure and wanted a particular result. Carlos, the junior mechanic, assisted her. He was 24 years old and had been at the facility for 8 months, and for the first 2 of those months he had been in awe of the more experienced mechanics and very quiet about it. He had become less quiet over time, as junior mechanics do, as confidence built in small increments with each job that went right. But this morning, he was quiet again with a different quality to his silence. He handed Maya tools when she asked for them. He held the inspection light in positions she indicated. He logged the measurements she called out with careful handwriting in the log. After about 40 minutes, he said, "How did you know?" Maya did not look up from what she was doing. "Know what?" "The rotor. You flagged it yesterday afternoon after only a manual inspection. Most of the guys would have needed at least an initial diagnostic run to catch what you caught." Maya was quiet for a moment. "You develop an ear for it," she said finally. "A feel. When something is wrong with a rotor system at certain RPM ranges, there's a specific quality to the vibration. Not a sound exactly. More like a frequency you pick up in your hands when you're in contact with the system." Carlos was quiet, absorbing that. "How long did it take you to develop that?" Maya calibrated a measurement and wrote it down before answering. "A while," she said. "You're doing fine, Carlos. Keep logging." He kept logging. 2 hours into the diagnostic, Thomas came back. He did not ask questions. He looked at the numbers Carlos had been logging, turned pages slowly, made small sounds under his breath that were not words. Then he set the log down and picked up a coffee and stood near the nose of the helicopter and drank it in silence. After a while, he said, "The clients are pushing for a noon departure." "I know," Maya said. "Operations director is getting calls from the federal liaison." "I know that too. And Derek is on the phone with our regional director." Maya emerged from beneath the tail section and looked at Thomas with the even expression she had been wearing all morning. "And what are the measurements telling you, Tom?" Thomas looked at the log. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "That you were right." "Yes," Maya said. "I was." She went back to work. At the 2-hour and 40-minute mark, something happened that changed the tempo of the morning. One of Derek's pilots, the co-pilot whose name was Reese, a younger man with a quiet manner that had kept him out of the morning's confrontation, came over to the helicopter and stood near Carlos for a moment without saying anything. Carlos noticed him and gave him a sideways look, but said nothing. Reese watched Maya work for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "I flew Blackhawks for 9 years before I went private sector." Maya did not look up. "Okay." "Military aviation, 2 deployments." "Okay." "I just wanted to say..." He stopped, started again. "I can see what you're doing. With the diagnostic, the methodology. That's not something you learn in a standard AMT certification." A pause. "No," Maya said. "It isn't." "Where'd you learn it?" She did not answer for a moment. The inspection light moved. The calibration tool made a small sound. "Same place you learned to fly in conditions that weren't on the training syllabus," she said finally. "You figure it out when you have to." Reese was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I'm going to go talk to Derek." He walked away. Maya said nothing, but something shifted slightly in the line of her shoulders. Not relaxation exactly. Something more like the subtle recalibration of a person who has been tracking multiple variables and has just watched one of them move in an unexpected direction. The conversation between Reese and Derek happened in the operations office. Thomas could see it through the glass partition, the gestures, the positioning, the particular stiffness in Derek's posture that said he was listening to something he did not want to hear. Reese was not an aggressive talker. He stood very still and spoke in a measured way that Thomas recognized as the communication style of someone who had learned to deliver information in high-stress environments without adding emotional noise to it. "Whatever." Reese said it lasted about 6 minutes. When it was over, Derek stood at the window of the operations office and looked out at the hangar floor. His expression was not readable from a distance. His eyes found Maya under the tail section of the helicopter, and they stayed there for a long moment. Then he turned away from the window. Thomas watched all of this and thought about the story he had heard 4 years ago, and he thought about the questions he had not asked Maya in the 8 months she had been working in his hangar, and he thought about the particular quality of judgment she brought to everything she did. The unhurried precision, the absence of the performance that most people put around their expertise to make sure other people noticed it. She did not perform. She just did the work. And the work was always exactly right. At the 3-hour and 40-minute mark, Maya completed the diagnostic. She climbed out from under the helicopter and stood up and took the maintenance log from Carlos and looked through the measurements for a final time. She did this slowly and thoroughly, the way she did everything, without rushing the last steps, just because the end was near. Then she wrote her final assessment on the documentation page, signed it, and handed the log to Thomas. He read it. His face went a specific kind of still that Maya recognized as the face of an experienced engineer confronting a number that confirmed something he had been hoping was wrong. Pitch horn assembly, he said. Fatigue fracture, early stage. Visible under magnification at the base of the primary attachment point. Maya said it straightforwardly. No emphasis, just the information. Under normal load it would have held. Under 6 hours of sustained flight load at altitude, the progression probability was significant. Maybe 70–75% chance of critical failure before landing. Thomas set the log down. How did you see it? He said. Yesterday, before the diagnostic. How did you know what you were looking for? Maya began packing her tools. The vibration pattern. I felt that specific signature before, in a different context. She paused. In a context where I could not run a diagnostic first and had to make a judgment call without the supporting data. Thomas looked at her. She was focused on her tools. Did the aircraft land? He asked. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Eventually, she said. She closed the tool case. Thomas stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up the maintenance log and walked toward the operations office, and the door opened, and he went in and closed it behind him. Maya could see the conversation through the glass. She did not watch it closely. She went to the workbench and made notes in her personal log, the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket that was separate from the official maintenance records. She wrote down the fault details, the diagnostic timeline, the final determination. She wrote these things down not because she was required to, but because she had learned in an earlier life that documentation was how the truth survived. The operations office door opened. Derek Vaughn came out first. He walked across the hangar floor toward Maya with a different quality to his movement than he had carried all morning. The aggressive ease was gone. He was not diminished exactly, but something had been reorganized inside the performance, and the result was a man who walked with slightly less certainty about what he was going to find when he got where he was going. He stopped in front of Maya. She looked up from her notebook. My co-pilot told me, Derek said, that the diagnostic confirmed the fault. Yes. 70–75% failure probability. In the range of 6 hours at full load. Yes. Derek was quiet for the moment. He looked at the helicopter. He looked at it the way pilots sometimes look at aircraft after they have learned something about them that changes the picture, with a kind of reassessment happening behind the eyes, running the flight backward in his head, thinking about what 6 hours at altitude would have looked like. If we'd flown, he said, you probably would have made it to about the 4-hour mark, Maya said. Depending on load distribution and atmospheric conditions, the failure would have been progressive. It wouldn't have been immediate. You might have had 5–10 minutes of handling degradation before it became critical. Derek absorbed that. Over the desert, he said. Yes. He was quiet again. Then he said, you knew all of that yesterday afternoon, before the diagnostic. I knew enough to flag it, Maya said. The diagnostic confirmed the details. But you knew enough. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. How? Maya looked back at him steadily. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about what kind of answer would satisfy him, and what kind of answer was actually true, and whether those two things were the same thing right now. Experience, she said finally. Derek held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked down. It was a small movement, barely a shift in his posture, but for a man who had spent the morning moving through the world with his chin up and his eyes forward, it was significant. Thomas saw it from across the hangar. Reese saw it from near the operations office door. The mission is scrubbed for today, Derek said. We're looking at a 24-hour delay pending repairs and re-inspection. He said it to the hangar in general, not to any specific person, the official communication of a change in plan. Then, in a different register, quieter and more direct. How long for the repair? Pitch horn assembly replacement, full re-inspection, and secondary diagnostic, Maya calculated. 12 hours if parts are on site. 15 if we need to source. I'll check parts inventory, Carlos said from behind her, and was already moving toward the parts room before anyone acknowledged him. Derek nodded. He stood for one more moment. Then he said to Maya, and only to Maya, in a voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the two of them, I want you to run the re-inspection. Maya said nothing. I know that's not a request I have any standing to make, Derek continued. Your facility staff. I'm a client. The inspection process is not mine to direct. A beat. I'm asking anyway. Maya held his gaze. I'll run the re-inspection, she said. He nodded once. He turned and walked away, and the distance he put between himself and the helicopter had a different quality than before. Not retreat. Something more like appropriate positioning, like a man who had recalibrated where he stood in relation to something. Thomas came out of the operations office a few minutes later and stood next to Maya at the workbench. Bill Harmon is already working on damage control with the federal liaison, he said, explaining the delay. He's actually using the diagnostic results to make the case showing due diligence. Thomas paused. 3 hours ago, he was ready to pressure you into signing the clearance. I know, Maya said. People respond to facts when the facts are unavoidable. Sometimes, Maya said. Sometimes they respond to the facts, and sometimes they just respond to who presents them. Thomas considered that. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. I've been trying to remember, he said, whether I asked you for references when you came on. Maya did not look up from her notebook. You asked for my certifications. AMT license, airframe and power plant ratings inspection authorization. I provided them. But not a service record. Mechanics don't typically have service records. No, Thomas said. They don't. He turned his mug again. Maya, I need to ask you something. She looked up. When you came here, what you took this job knowing what it was, knowing the kind of work, the hours, the anonymity of it. Was that a choice? Maya looked at him for a moment without answering. It was not the look of someone trying to construct a lie, or even trying to choose between truths. It was the look of someone who had answered a simpler version of this question privately many times, and was now being asked the real version of it in public, and was deciding how much of the real version to give. Yes, she said finally. Why this? She was quiet for long enough that Thomas thought she was not going to answer. She picked up her notebook, closed it, put it in her breast pocket. She looked at the Bell 429 sitting grounded in the maintenance bay, the fault in its pitchhorn assembly, now documented and confirmed its passengers safe on the ground instead of over the desert in an aircraft with a 75% chance of catastrophic failure at hour 4. Because this matters, she said simply. What we do here, it's not... She stopped. She looked for the words with the care of someone who does not use words carelessly. It's not quiet because it doesn't matter. It matters because it's quiet. Nobody is watching. Nobody is making sure. It's just the work and the machine, and whether you did it right. She paused. I needed a place where that was enough. Thomas looked at her for a long time. The tattoo, he said. She did not flinch. Yes, I heard a story, he said, 4 years ago, from someone who was on the edge of an incident, an extraction that went wrong and then went right. A woman who... He stopped himself. He looked at her. I don't need the details. I'm not asking for them. I just want to know. Maya met his eyes. Was it you? He said. The hangar hummed with ventilation and the distant sound of Carlos pulling parts in the back room and the ordinary working noise of a facility that had just avoided something significant. Maya held Thomas's gaze. Like I said, she said quietly. Parts on site 12 hours. We should get started. She turned back to the helicopter. And Thomas Reed, who had spent 35 years learning to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant, understood that he had just received the only answer he was going to get, and that it was in its way a complete one. He set down his coffee. He rolled up his sleeves. Tell me where you want me, he said. And the two of them went to work. The repair work started at 11:17 in the morning and did not stop. Maya set the pace, and Thomas matched it, and Carlos moved between them like he was trying to absorb everything at once, which he was. The pitch horn assembly replacement was precise work that required complete attention and no shortcuts, and Maya gave it both the way she gave everything, both without announcement and without the particular performance of effort that some technicians put on when they knew people were watching. People were watching. The other mechanics on the morning shift had not gone home when their hours ended. Nobody had said anything about staying. Nobody had asked anyone to. They had simply not left, drifting back to adjacent workbenches, finding small tasks that needed doing in the general vicinity of the Bell 429, keeping themselves technically occupied while remaining within range of what was happening. It was the kind of collective decision that does not get made out loud. The slow gravitational pull of something significant happening in a space where most days nothing significant happened at all. Derek Vaughn had not left either. He had retreated to a corner of the hangar where there was a folding chair that nobody usually used, and he had been sitting in it for the past 2 hours, with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes on Maya. Not watching the repair work exactly. Watching her. The way she moved. The way she made decisions. The way she communicated with Thomas and Carlos, direct and spare, saying exactly what needed to be said, and nothing additional. He had the look of a man quietly dismantling something he had built, going back through the architecture of the morning, and taking apart each assumption he had laid down one by one, and looking at what was underneath. Reese sat near him, but said nothing. That was its own kind of conversation. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Bill Harmon came out of the operations office with 2 paper cups of coffee and walked across the hangar floor to where Maya and Thomas were working. He set one cup near Thomas's elbow without being asked, then held the other out toward Maya. She looked at the cup for a moment, then at Bill. He had the expression of a man who understood he owed a debt he did not quite know how to pay. "Thank you," she said, and took the cup. Bill stood there for a moment, holding nothing, with the particular posture of someone who came to say something and is now deciding whether to say it. "The Federal liaison called back," he said. "I explained the situation. The mechanical fault, the diagnostic, the delay." He paused. "They said they understood. They actually said they were glad we caught it before the flight." Another pause. "I want you to know that I should have said that this morning." Maya looked at him. "When you flagged the aircraft," Bill continued, "I should have stood behind the flag immediately, not after the diagnostic confirmed it. I should have backed you the moment you wrote it up, because that is what the process is for, and I let other pressures make me—" He stopped. "I want you to know that I recognize that." Maya said, "I know, Bill." She went back to work. Bill stood for another second, then nodded to no one in particular and walked back to the operations office. Thomas watched him go. "That was hard for him," he said quietly. "Yes," Maya said. "It was. Good." Thomas glanced at her. "Good. Hard things should feel hard," she said. "That's how you remember them." They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Thomas said, without looking up from what he was doing, "I looked something up this morning, in the operations office, after the diagnostic." Maya said nothing, which was not the same as asking him to continue, but was not asking him to stop either. "There was a DoD brief," Thomas said. "Unclassified, so it was accessible, 4 years ago. A general reference to a non-standard extraction support scenario that resulted in successful extraction of a 7-person team after primary aircraft incapacitation. The brief was 3 sentences long. No names, no unit designation, no details. He adjusted a component, but it mentioned the location. Maya tightened a bolt to spec, and it mentioned that the person who stabilized the aircraft long enough for secondary extraction had maintained flight-worthy condition in a vehicle with a non-functional pitch control system. Thomas paused. For 41 minutes. The hangar was quiet enough that the sound of the tool in Maya's hand was audible. 41 minutes, Thomas said again softly, more to himself than to her. In a damaged aircraft. In that environment. He shook his head slightly. That's why you knew. That's why you felt it in your hands yesterday afternoon. Because you have felt that exact failure signature before, from the inside. Maya did not confirm or deny. She picked up the calibration tool and moved to the next checkpoint. But her jaw was set in a specific way that Thomas had learned in the past several hours was the closest she came to acknowledgement. The afternoon wore on, with the particular weight of contained information. Everything that had been said and everything that had not been said, hanging in the air of the hangar like humidity. The mechanics who had stayed worked steadily. Carlos had not said more than 20 words since the morning, but his work was clean and precise, and he was paying attention in a way that would benefit him for the rest of his career. At 3:40, Derek Vaughn stood up from the folding chair. He walked across the hangar floor to the Bell 429 and stopped a few feet away, watching Maya complete the final stage of the pitch horn replacement. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. Maya was aware of him in the peripheral way she was aware of everything in any space she occupied continuously and without visible effort. "How long have you been a mechanic?" he said finally. She did not look up. "About 8 months." A beat. "Before that?" "Different things," she said. Another pause. "Different things that involved knowing the failure signature of a pitch control system under combat load conditions." Maya stopped what she was doing. She set the tool down. She turned and looked at Derek Vaughn directly, and the look was neither hostile nor warm, neither forgiving nor withholding. It was simply clear. The look of someone who is done with indirection and has decided to be in the room with the actual situation. "What do you want to know?" she said. Derek seemed to not have expected the directness. He recalibrated quickly with the adaptability of an experienced pilot who has had to adjust to changing conditions mid-flight. "I want to know," he said carefully, "who I was talking to this morning." "You were talking to your mechanic," Maya said. "Same person you're talking to now." "That's not—" He stopped. "That's not a complete answer. It's the complete answer to what matters right now," Maya said. "The aircraft is being repaired correctly. The fault has been documented. The flight can proceed safely in approximately 8 hours pending successful re-inspection." She picked up her tool again. "That's what this morning was about." Derek watched her. "No," he said. "That's what it should have been about. What it was actually about was me deciding who you were based on what I saw when I walked into this hangar and being completely wrong." Maya said nothing. "I grabbed your arm," he said. It came out flat and quiet without the surrounding language that people usually put around an admission like that to soften its edges. Just the fact placed directly between them. That was— He stopped. Not searching for a word exactly. More like making sure the word he chose was accurate. "That was wrong." The hangar was quiet. Thomas had stopped working, though he appeared to be looking at the maintenance log. Maya held Derek's gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It was. I know an apology doesn't change what happened." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But I'm offering one anyway." He said it without the hesitation or the performance that apologies often carry. He said it the way someone says something that they have decided to say and are saying now completely not halfway. "I'm sorry. For the arm. For the other things I said. For making an assumption about who you were that had nothing to do with your actual qualifications and everything to do with what you looked like in those coveralls." Maya looked at him. The thing she was deciding was not visible on her face. It was happening behind her eyes in the private space where people make real assessments of real situations outside the performance of how they are supposed to respond. "I've met people like you before," she said finally. "Plenty of them. Good pilots, strong records, competent in the air." She paused. The ones who couldn't take being wrong on the ground were usually the most dangerous in the air. Not because they weren't skilled. Because they had never learned how to separate their ego from their judgment. She held his gaze. "The ones who could hear it when they were wrong, those were the ones I trusted with my life, eventually." Derek took that in. "Eventually," he said. "It takes time to earn that kind of trust," Maya said. "What you did this morning doesn't earn it. But this—" She gestured slightly at the space between them at the conversation itself. "This is a start." Derek nodded. Something settled in him that had been unsettled all day. He looked at the helicopter. "Will you tell me?" he said. "Not the classified details, not anything you're not willing to say, but the 41 minutes. Someone told me about it, just the outline, and I—" He stopped. "I want to understand how that is possible." Maya was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You've flown in conditions where the aircraft was not performing the way it should. Emergencies. Partial system failures. Yes. In those situations when the controls are degraded and you're running on partial authority and you're trying to keep it in the air, what is it that you're doing?" Derek thought about it seriously because it was a serious question. "Making constant adjustments. Reading what the aircraft gives you instead of what you want it to give you. Working with what's there instead of what should be there." "Yes," Maya said. "Now imagine doing that from outside the aircraft, from underneath it, with tools that are not the right tools, in conditions that are not the right conditions, with a timeline that has no margin." She looked at him. "It's the same principle. You find out what the machine can still do, and you help it do that, and you keep going until you can't. Derek was quiet for several seconds. What happened to the aircraft? He asked. After. It didn't make it, Maya said. It was simple and flat, and carried the weight of something that had been put in a certain place and lived there. We got everyone out first, then it didn't make it. And you? She looked at the Bell 429 for a moment. I made it, she said. Different kind of not making it, but I made it. There was something in the way she said it that closed the conversation gently, but completely, the way a door settles into its frame. Derek recognized the sound of it and did not push further. He stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to call the federal liaison myself. Explain the delay as what it was a proactive maintenance catch that prevented a probable critical failure. I'm going to say it in those words on record. Maya looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. But I'd like to. He walked away. And Thomas Reed, who had been entirely too focused on the maintenance log for the last 8 minutes to have absorbed any of the conversation, looked up and met Maya's eyes. She looked back at him. 12 minutes ago, you stopped pretending to read that log, she said. He set it down without any visible embarrassment. The ventilation in here is very poor. Every word carries. Yes, Maya said. It does. The ghost of something that was almost a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth and disappeared. They went back to work. The reinspection began at 6:47 in the evening. Maya ran IT personally, which she had told Derek she would do, and which she would have done regardless of whether she had told him, because the reinspection of a repair she had made was her responsibility, and she did not delegate her responsibilities. Thomas ran the secondary review simultaneously, which was proper protocol for a repair of this scope, and Carlos documented everything with the careful handwriting that had become over the course of the day, the record of something that was more than just a maintenance repair. The hangar had thinned out by then. The mechanics who had stayed through the afternoon had eventually drifted home. Not all at once, but in the gradual way of people who had stayed as long as they needed to stay, and were now satisfied that things were in the right hands. Bill Harmon had gone home at 5 after stopping to tell Maya that he had spoken with the regional director and that her documentation on the fault and the repair would be commended in the facility's quarterly safety review. She had thanked him and gone back to work. Derek and Reese remained. They did not get in the way, which was itself a significant act, because men like Derek Vaughn were not naturally inclined to stay in spaces where they were not in charge of anything. But Derek sat in his corner, and Reese sat near him, and neither man did anything that could be described as interfering. And Maya noticed this, and noted it with the quiet part of her attention that tracked everything. The reinspection took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Maya went through every checkpoint sequentially without abbreviation, at the pace dictated by thoroughness, and not by anything else. At the end, she stood back from the aircraft and looked at it for a moment, not performing a final look, but actually looking the deep and focused attention of someone who is making a final determination about a complex system that they have just spent most of a day returning to airworthy status. Then she took the maintenance log from Carlos and wrote her final sign-off. She signed it, dated it, handed it to Thomas, who reviewed it and signed it below her signature. Then she walked across the hangar and held it out to Derek. He took it. He looked at the sign-off. He looked at her. It's good, he said. It's good, she said. Full airworthiness, no outstanding flags, pitch horn assembly replaced and confirmed to spec. Secondary diagnostic clean. She held his gaze. You can fly in the morning. Derek looked down at the log again. He did not look like a man who had won something. He looked like a man who was holding a document that had cost more than he anticipated to obtain, and who was beginning to understand what the cost had actually been. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words, and it was not complicated, and he said it like he meant it, which was the only way it was worth saying. Maya nodded once. She turned and began putting away her tools. Behind her, she heard Derek say something quietly to Reese, and she heard Reese respond, and neither of them was saying anything she needed to hear. She focused on the tool case, on the precise order in which things went back into their places, on the satisfying small sounds of a job completed correctly. Then Carlos said from behind her, Maya. She turned. He was standing there with an expression that was not quite sure of itself. the expression of a 24-year-old who has learned something significant in a single day and is trying to figure out how to relate to the person who taught it to him. "I'm glad you didn't sign it," he said. "This morning. I'm glad you stood there and didn't sign it." Maya looked at him. "So am I," she said. Carlos nodded with the seriousness of someone filing something away where he